This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for another Citations Needed live stream. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated. We also have a merch shop at bonfire.com. And that is bonfire.com/store/citations-needed. All your help through Bonfire is also incredibly appreciated. We are 100% listener funded. All of your support through Patreon and Bonfire helps keep the show going.
Yes, and as always, please support us on Patreon if you can. It helps keep the episodes free and the show sustainable, and helps bring these awesome live shows streaming to YouTube. That's three-dimensional right there.
That was nice.
Without further ado, though, we are very excited to talk about today's topic and be joined by today's guests.
I know. So we are recording just 10 days out from the opening ceremonies of the 2024 Olympics in Paris, France. One might not know from the often breathless media coverage in the run-up to these kinds of games, but for months, the city of Paris has been preparing for this year's event by ramping up policing, evicting homeless people from the encampments that they've been living in, and even banning food distribution in certain regions of the city, according to the French collective Le Reverse de la Médaille, which in English translates to the other side of the medal. And this really does continue a decades-long pattern of cities around the world, such as Los Angeles, Tokyo, Atlanta, the list goes on, of arresting, imprisoning, expelling, and otherwise abusing their most vulnerable populations prior to hosting the Olympics. Of course, this always further entrenches pre-existing inequities. All the while, cities harness the immensely powerful PR of hosting the games and enjoy overwhelmingly uncritical, even glowing coverage from the likes of media such as CBS News, New York Times, and of course, the Olympic broadcaster, NBC. And so, as Adam noted, we are so excited to be joined tonight to talk about this and so much more by Jules Boykoff. Jules is the author of 6 books on the Olympic Games, most recently, What Are the Olympics For?, which was published by Bristol University Press in 2024, and the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Race, Power, and Sportswashing, which was published last year, 2023, by Common Ground. Previously, he was a professional soccer player who represented the U.S. Olympic soccer team in international competition, and he currently teaches political science at Pacific University in Oregon, and will soon, and we'll talk about this in a bit, will be headed to Paris himself to cover the games this summer. Jules, welcome back to Citations Needed. It is so great to see you again.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be back with you guys.
Yes, really great to have us on. I think it's you're officially our senior Olympics correspondent.
Nice.
Since we every 2 to 4 years we'll have you on to talk about what are both original problems specific to Paris, but also problems that, of course, you've been writing about for years that are inherent in these type of large international sporting events. Same with the World Cup, which we'll also talk about. And I want to sort of begin by talking about the issue specifically with France, and we can kind of move out from there. Because again, I think that on the one hand, and I think I speak for everyone on this show, on this call, there is a duality. There is a sort of understanding that these things are sinister and evil, that they prop up despotic rulers, serve corporate interests, purge the poor, can lead to surveillance, over-policing. They help embolden anti-democratic forces, and of course, they're ripe with corruption. But that's actually not really something I care about. If some guy gets a bag of cash, it's sort of less interesting to me. But it's part of a broader ecology of things that don't really promote justice, don't promote democracy, and don't promote what's good for the working class. But on the other hand, they're badass. They're cool. It's cool to watch people at the peak of their game do it really well, especially since this is kind of the thing they look forward to for 4 years. Most of the sports, this isn't like basketball or soccer. It's not provided support year round. So this 4 years is what these people look forward to. And of course, there's nothing, there's these great kind of rags to riches stories, right? Every time there's a sporting event on, it seems like every other athlete came out of abject poverty or just got over cancer. So it's sort of very like dramatic, very entertaining. And of course, we feel for these people. We want to succeed for these people. And these two forces are always, going at it. And so I want to sort of talk about the games in France, how this is playing out in France. There's been obviously protests going on there for months now. It was very combative. So I want to sort of talk about what the local pushback is in France. Obviously, you'll be traveling there soon. You've been doing reporting on this for months now. Now, the far right did lose the elections. That was something that a lot of people were worried about, this kind of being a kind of mini 1936 Berlin. They avoided that. But at the same time, there's still a lot of anger, still a lot of activist energy opposing these things. So can you talk about the current lay of the land in Paris as it stands right now?
Absolutely. You did a nice summation there of a lot of the issues that plague the Olympics. One way of kind of summarizing what you said is that the Olympics tend to bring out the best in athletes and the worst in host cities. And it's not just one host city, it's all host cities. When people in your city decide to host the Olympics, they decide to bring on all these problems. Now, France was saying that they were going to be different. If we kind of rewind the clock for a second, it was 2017. We were in the midst of a spate of cities just saying no thank you to the Olympics, either by referendum, the mere threat of a referendum, or by an elected official taking office on an explicit anti-Olympics platform, as happened in Rome. So what was happening was there were a number of cities that were bidding on the 2024 Olympics, including Paris and Los Angeles. All the other cities dropped out of the competition, leaving only Paris and Los Angeles. The International Olympic Committee, the so-called and self-proclaimed supreme authority of the Olympics, decided to do a fancy move. They assigned two Olympics at one time. They gave Paris 2024 and Los Angeles 2028. And the rhetoric around both those cities was really similar. It was like, we're going to be different. We're going to sidestep all those problems that you pesky leftists like to talk about. And instead, we're going to have a perfect Olympics, both of us. Well, how has that turned out? I mean, it hasn't happened, first of all. I mean, if you go through the problems that you just nicely delineated, Adam, costs, they're actually higher, 115% cost overruns in Paris, and it promises to get even worse. The displacement of locals, it's been really, really intense, and there have been great activism on the ground. I mean, Nima, you mentioned Le Revers de la Médaille. They've been really active trying to raise this issue. Militarization of public space, well, they passed the first ever AI video surveillance law that will be used just supposedly for the Olympics, but that is supposed to be sunsetting in March 2025. They used the Olympics as a pretext to get that law. In fact, it was part of a law called the Olympic Law. It doesn't take the imagination of an avant-garde poet to conjure scenarios by which they say, oh, we have information, we thwarted a number of terrorist attacks, we need to keep that AI video surveillance after the games. What about greenwashing? You know, the bar was really low. Some of the most recent Olympics have been some of the worst greenwashers of all time. And Paris, I guess you could say, kind of tiptoed over that bar that was sitting on the floor. But still, I mean, some horrific stuff happening. They're hosting surfing in Tahiti, for example. I don't know how green that is, traveling 9,735 miles in an airplane to go to Tahiti, setting aside the sort of colonial lacquer that's on the entire situation, when they were building an optional tower to view to get the best video footage of the surfers. The barge that came in ground up a delicate coral reef in Teahupo, Tahiti. The locals were going wild, just so upset about what was happening to their area. I don't know how you can call that sustainable. And so all of these problems we've been seeing in Paris, despite the fact that they were saying they'd be different. Last point, you mentioned that just in the last few weeks, there was a real threat from the far right. The Rassemblement National almost won the elections. There was real fear that that was going to happen. And this would have gifted an opportunity for the far right wing in the country to look important on the global stage when the global media show up. In other words, to engage in sportswashing, looking legitimate on the global stage, providing nationalism for all and deflecting attention from various problems that are domestic. So, going into these Olympics, I know I'm a political scientist, but I have to say these are the most political Olympics that we've seen in decades for the reasons that I gave and a lot of other reasons as well.
Yeah, because I want to just as a quick follow-up, the criticism of the Olympics and the World Cup is that it is this kind of contrived, scheduled shock doctrine because under the banner of hosting a bunch of people from out of town and making the city look good. They do a version of the Simpsons gag where they go to the fancy suburban neighborhood and the mailbox the homeless person sort of turns into a mailbox. It's like we just want to sort of out of the way, and which is of course the general neoliberal approach to poverty in general, but it kind of speeds it up, prevents democratic pushback. Obviously, in places like Brazil and South Africa, they were like literally constitution-free zones. Has Paris seen any of this kind of more overtly despotic kind of Judge Dredd type, or do they have the kind of institutional left that can push back against that? Although French leftists are always kind of hit or miss historically. Can you kind of comment on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, starting with the shock doctrine, Naomi Klein's idea of disaster capitalism, I think that the Olympics provide an example of a complementary dynamic that I call celebration capitalism. Your listeners and viewers will be familiar with Naomi Klein's ideas, but basically disaster capitalism, a tornado hits, an economic downturn, and capitalists capitalize off the catastrophe and phase in as quickly as possible neoliberal policies, privatizing everything with a pulse, getting rid of regulations. But it all comes down to the state of exception that disaster creates. Well, the Olympics create a state of exception as well. It's just a celebratory state of exception. And it too allows for local officials, national officials to ram through all sorts of laws that would be basically impossible to put through during normal political times. Now, were the French more sensible about it than maybe other places in the past? I'm not so sure, really. I mean, if you look at the brutality that's being meted out right now, day in and day out, as French authorities somewhat desperately try to clear the streets of anybody who even looks like an unhoused person, for fear of like us tourists or journalists coming through and being scared by seeing an unhoused person in the road. That's pretty intense that's happening right now. And people are being bussed, many of them against their will. It's kind of what somebody described as an antechamber to deportation, because many of these folks they get housed temporarily and then they get booted out of the country. And so I'm not sure how friendly that is. And then what I mentioned before about the intensification of AI-powered video surveillance, no other country in the European Union had done that. So France might have this sort of image of for the rest of us, but I would have to say it's largely conforming under celebration capitalism to some of the ugliest things that we've seen in terms of previous Olympics.
Yeah, I kind of want to dig into something that you mentioned about how, yes, we did avoid, I guess, a far right celebration of nationalism having the Olympics after winning an election. That didn't happen in France. Great, but I really want to kind of talk about this idea of whitewashing in general. Now, back in January, Jules, you wrote about how the Olympics often provide a useful way for war criminals to whitewash their image. Of course, you cite specifically Russia and Israel as two of the most urgent examples in the world right now. But this list could, of course, just as well include the United States, given its lockstep patronage of Israel's genocide in Gaza and also its entire history as a nation. So, now people opposed to this type of moral criteria for hosting might say something like, look, if we go down this road, then the Olympics will just be basically a contest between Costa Rica and Denmark playing each other in ping pong. You need the whole world to be there. And can you really kind of establish those sorts of barriers? But I guess my question to you is, how does one make these types of distinctions, right? In this sense, and can events like these ever really avoid sports washing? Would it be easier just to get rid of these things altogether, or do we just have to live with these spectacles being simultaneously inspiring at the athletic level, as we discussed, while grotesque at a structural one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that question. I mean, for starters, it's really easy for somebody like me to waggle a finger at China or Russia, for example, for extreme human rights abuses in the lead up to the Olympics that don't at all chime with the spirit of the Olympics, let alone specific provisions within the Olympic Charter. But I think it's important to point out that these same things are very similar things happen in democracies as well. In the lead into the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the bidders in Beijing and wider China were saying that if you give us the Olympics, it's going to bring this democratic heyday. Just give us the games and magic will happen. Well, that magic never happened. In fact, Sophie Richardson, who was in charge of the China program at Human Rights Watch, said that the Olympics in 2008 were actually a catalyst for intensified repression in the wake of the games. And so it's easy to say that, but at the same time, what people need to remember is that it's true that the Olympics do not make authoritarian countries more democratic. But what's also true is that the Olympics definitely make democracies more authoritarian. And you're definitely seeing that in France in regards to the laws that are being passed. And it raises a real issue around sports washing. So if we accept sports washing as political leaders using sports as a way to further nationalism, look legitimate while the world's media shows up and deflect attention from the domestic problems that plague the particular society, it should be clear, although it's not to a lot of people, that this can happen in an authoritarian setting or a democratic setting. And I should say, of course, there's gray zones between those two. I'm just being quick and reductive just for the point. But sports washing very much happens in democratic spaces. It allows us to ignore the problems or try to sweep them away. And, you mentioned the issue of Russia, the issue of Israel. And I'm glad you brought that up because we very much need to talk about that. Everybody's going to be talking about those two situations when the Olympics arrive in Paris. So if we start with Russia, they have a long history of being in fights with the International Olympic Committee. I mean, hey, they got caught doping at their own Olympics. It was like a James Bond spy novel. They were like passing beakers of urine through this little secret hole in the wall, clean and dirty bottles. They got caught for that. And then they invaded Crimea between the Olympics and Paralympics that they were hosting in 2014. And then in 2022, they invaded Ukraine between the Beijing Olympics and Paralympics. So they very much got on the bad side of the International Olympic Committee. And that is why, that last reason, the invasion of Ukraine, is why Russia will not be participating in the Paris Olympics, at least not under their flag. And it's important to point out, I think, if we want to be specific, that there are two specific reasons that the International Olympic Committee gave to ban Russia from the 2024 Olympics. One of them was they broke the Olympic truce. Now, the Olympic truce is basically this piece of paper that the United Nations puts forth. It's a resolution that they agree to, that everyone's going to try to shun war for the period around the Olympic Games. It is routinely violated. I don't have to tell you guys, but the United States did not stop invading and occupying Afghanistan and Iraq during all those Olympics. They just kept on going. Yeah, believe it or not. And of course, the IOC didn't say a word when the US continued to do that. So it's kind of quirky that the International Olympic Committee all of a sudden started acting like the Olympic truce had some kind of enforcement capability. The second reason I think is more important because the first reason doesn't apply to Israel. They haven't been bombing Gaza and engaging in genocide during any kind of Olympic truce period. But the second reason that the IOC gave to ban Russia from these Olympics, except under specific circumstances, is that the Russian military took over specific territory in Ukraine, and then the Russian Olympic Committee basically started to run those sports clubs in the territory that had been taken over. Now, if we pause there for a second and we look at what's happening in Gaza right now, things start to look kind of similar. Now, I am definitely not saying it's the same. I mean, history does not provide us with those kind of crisp facsimiles of comparison, but if you look at Gaza, every single soccer field has either been decimated or massively damaged where you can't play on it anymore. Yarmouk Stadium, as Karim Zidane, the great journalist, has covered in detail, Yarmouk Stadium, this storied stadium in Gaza for football, for soccer, was used by the Israeli Defense Forces as an internment camp for detainees. Now, that sounds a lot like taking over territory and taking over sports grounds, doesn't it? You might think the International Olympic Committee might be jumping up and down about that. Again, not a word. In fact, the International Olympic Committee, when asked about this, has said that they will do everything in their capacity to keep Israeli athletes and staff safe. Not a word about excluding them in the ways that they've done with Russia. Those are two of the major reasons why I said before that I think that these Olympics will be thrumming with more politics than any recent games in memory.
Yeah, because I
So
mean,
are you saying that there's a double standard when it comes to Russia and Israel? Hold on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously the IOC is full of shit, right? I mean, and this is about who you can kind of get away with banning and who you can. I mean, again, the U.S. has a quarter of the world's population. If that's not authoritarian, I don't know what is, despite having only 5% of the population. But yet, that's never really an issue that's brought up in terms of whether or not they meet a human rights criteria, regardless of whether or not they're backing genocide. And so the whole thing is obviously like, yeah, it's like a lot of international law. We've talked about it on the show to death. It's obviously going to be selectively applied based on the relative power. Obviously, the U.S., God forbid, they weren't in the Olympics. I mean, that would cost billions and billions and billions of dollars to the IOC and others. And I think that's kind of what, when we talk about, is it just sort of inherent? Because I think when you do go down that road, if you did it selectively, even if you had a pretty high standard, I still think you would be left with not as many countries. Because I do think that so much of how these oppressive mechanisms are kind of spread out, especially in Europe and in North America. So I want to sort of ask a question about, or Nima, do you want to ask the third question?
No, go for it.
Okay,
yeah. Sure. Well,
go ahead.
it really just is, Jules, you had mentioned this kind of economic propaganda, right? The idea that, amid a frenzy of gold medals and rags to riches stories we've been talking about, is the promise of this kind of economic heyday. All the while, of course, masking the reality, which is the impact that these, massive sporting events have on the poor in their host countries. And, you really kind of laid some of that out. But I want to kind of get back into that, especially because the IOC itself, I mean, like, sells this. It's not only that the host countries are kind of selling this to their own citizens or using these arguments to kind of bid for the games, right? But the IOC itself, and feel free to talk about the IOC and kind of its whole role in all of this. But in its own press release about the games in Paris, said that the games would, quote, maximize the socioeconomic impact of sport, end quote. And especially for France's lower classes, right? Now, in your experience, in your research, in your writing, what does the evidence really have to say about these kinds of promises? And, what other examples have we seen, right? I mean, there's a case study every 2 to 4 years when it comes to, say, World Cups or Olympics. So what, these games going to Brazil, in South Africa, whether it has to do with the World Cup, like, what was actually the impact, both short term during the games and then longer term, and how does that match up with the promises made?
Yeah, one of the big myths around the Olympics is that it's going to create this economic utopia, lift everybody's boats higher, and so on, especially the poor. That's been the recent argument. Unfortunately, there's basically no data to support that. I mean, let's just take a look at an Olympics that a lot of Olympic boosters think was a total success, and that was the London 2012 Olympics. Set aside the fact that they were supposed to originally cost $3.8 billion, 3.8, but they ended up costing $38 billion, according to Sky Sports News.
What's a decimal place here?
Just a decimal point.
Yeah.
Was this the one where they had the surface to air batteries on top of people's apartment complexes?
That's right, where they put surface to air missiles on the top of people's roofs and inform them. Sure. Yeah, by slipping the piece of paper under the resident's door, informing them. By the way,
about the leaflets.
So
as long as you drop leaflets, you know that you can get away with whatever, right?
Right, exactly. So, I mean, take a look at London. They had huge promises about how it was going to help people who are struggling economically in the city. And in fact, one of the ways that Olympic boosters do this, and London did this, was they talk about the Olympic Village, the place where the athletes stay during the Olympics, that is usually built special for the games. And they talk about how they're going to take that and they're going to convert it into a certain portion of social housing. And so that's what they promised in London. They were going to create 30,000 new units for poor folks, for people living under the poverty line. Well, guess what happened then? They started building this Olympic Village. Things started going poorly. This Lend-Lease corporation from Australia basically botched the job. The project was nationalized, which is to say taxpayers in the UK were now paying for it. And then, as if that weren't enough, they decided to turn the project over at a taxpayer loss of like £275 million pounds to the Qatari ruling family's property firm. Well, guess what? When Qatar got in charge of the program, they weren't as interested in having all those social housing slots. So only a fraction of the slots that were supposed to go to those who deserve them under the auspices of social housing actually got them. That's just the housing. I mean, that just didn't get followed up on. Sebastian Coe, who you'll see all over the Olympics in Paris because he now runs World Athletics, he was the guy penning an op-ed for the Guardian promising these 30,000 units that never materialized. I would love for a journalist to ask Seb Coe at these Olympics what happened to all those units that he promised. What about other promises around London and other Olympics? Like London said that if you give us the Olympics, we're going to basically turn our society around health-wise. It's going to jumpstart everybody's interest in playing sport. Well, how did that work out? Well, according to the Lancet, there was no uptick in the amount of youth playing sports after the Olympic Games. They weren't inspired by the athletes to get out there and try it themselves. A national government audit found that there was actually a decrease in young people playing sports in the wake of the Olympics. So the track record is incredibly thin when it comes to these things. And one of the built-in mechanisms that really helps sustain the games and makes it difficult for people like us to foment change is that most of us, including certainly the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, they just jet on to the next venue. Like they're out. You know, the attention is not on that city that hosted before, it's on the next place. And I will say, you know, I'm somewhat guilty of this as well. You know, I'm trying to keep up myself with what's going on in each place, but it almost seems like it's part of the plan. And that's why I kind of think it is.
Well, right, because you're serving corporate and real estate interests, and the electeds they own, and it's about getting it in, jamming in these developments, you know, having the public finance their real estate projects, and promoting and funding more police and surveillance. And then once that's done, this sort of, you know, it expedites plans that have in many ways already exist, which everybody kind of knows. And this is why it's you know, this is obviously, but you mentioned that there was only two cities that were even trying to get these Olympics, which I think would be a surprise to many people listening to that. That's like sort of me winning the Best Citations Needed host award. No offense, Nima, but you know,
if we each get a co-host award, Adam.
Oh, we each get one. Well, that's even. Oh, that's true. That's true. They both
Olympics.
got one. So they both got one. So yeah, it would not be the most. I wouldn't put that on my profile as a point of career pride. So then my question becomes: is, you know, increasingly we see this with the stadium grift, where owners threaten to leave and public gives them tax dollars. Now, obviously that still happens. It happened in New York State with the Bill Stadium, but it's happening less. People are kind of hip to this. Democratic forces, again, groups in LA, for example, that you work with have pushed back on this. So do you envision a time 20 years from now when, again, assuming the processes of democracy or even some of these more maybe technocratic run governments that don't have maybe direct democracy, but can still look at a P&L sheet and know they're getting ripped off, is there a future you foresee where nobody's going to want to have the Olympics, at least based on the criteria, which of course leads to my follow-up question, which is there a way of doing it where you don't screw people over and it is more democratic, is more transparent, doesn't involve liquidating sort of unseemly homeless people? And what does that look like? Because it does seem like it's not as popular as it used to be, even among the kind of real estate bought technocrats.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, there's no question about it that fewer and fewer cities are game to host the Olympic Games. Like, that's just a fact. So what does the International Olympic Committee do when it's presented with this harsh reality for them? Do they look at all the problems that we've been talking about today, from overspending to greenwashing to displacement to militarization of public space? Hell no, they don't do that. Instead, they change the rules of how they give out the games. So previously, the standard was to give out the Olympics 7 years in advance of actually staging the Olympics. Los Angeles broke the mold in the sense that they gave the Los Angeles Olympics in 2017, but they won't host them until 2028. And it's almost like you can see the flickers in the heads of the International Olympic Committee. Like, why are we so wedded to this 7-year thing? So basically what they do now is whenever they can get the elites from a city to agree to fund the Olympics and get the governments from those places to say, yeah, we'll cover cost overruns, they just lock that city in, sometimes 11 years in advance. Like Brisbane is a good example of that. And the guy who came up with this scheme of giving out the Olympics whenever is a guy named John Coates. Guess where he's from, guys? He's from Australia. Imagine that. And so the first city and country that benefits from that happens to be John Coates's Australia. This, by the way, is the same guy who, on the eve of the vote for the 2000 Olympics, for whether it was Sydney and Beijing, and it was neck and neck, he just, the night before the vote, gave $70,000 to two different National Olympic committees where there were people who were on the Olympic Committee that were going to be voting, International Olympic Committee the next day that were going to vote. And guess what? He won by 2 votes. And he openly says, like, it wasn't illegal. It was just the way it works. And I was just being generous, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't even deny this, right? So the International Olympic Committee has changed the rules of the game because of the scenario that you described. So how do you get around it? I mean, one way is definitely activism against the Olympics. And an interesting test case is one that we're going to see unfolding over the next few days, actually, because it looks like the International Olympic Committee is interested in doling out, assigning the 2030 Winter Olympics and possibly the 2034 Winter Olympics at the same time. And everybody who follows these things thinks that the 2030 Olympics might go to the French Alps. Well, all these people in France, like in Paris, are kind of like, wait a second, we actually know now that we're on the eve of the Olympics, the way this thing works. And so you got a lot of people organizing in Paris, up in the French Alps, that are saying, no, we don't want this. And it might actually slow down their process. Their original goal, the IOC's original goal, was to hand these things out right before the Olympics start. Well, I'll be really interested to see whether they're actually able to do that. You know, this is one of those areas where activism actually has made a difference. I don't want to overstate it because this is definitely like a David versus Goliath situation on steroids. Like, this is like seriously difficult. But activists in combination with critical journalists, in combination with critical academics have really changed the way that we talk about these things, and it made life much more difficult for the International Olympic Committee. Now, to your second question, in regards to like, well, can these even be done on an ethical basis? I've really evolved my position on this over the years, and I've come to this. I don't think the Olympics can currently be staged in an ethical way under the direction of the current International Olympic Committee. They've had a chance. They've given it a go. They have shown time and again that they are absolutely not up for the job. You know, last time we talked a few years back, we were sort of joking about the fact that the IOC has this really high royalty quotient. You know, they have like all these counts and dukes and princes.
Yeah.
And since 1981, they started allowing women. So they have princesses now. And now they have sheikhs as well.
That's progress. That's progress.
Yeah, they've diversified. They allow princesses and sheikhs. But
they have sheikesses. Okay.
yeah, right. And so, and guess what? The quotient is still as high today. So they're not changing their ways in any sense. So we just got to get rid of this group of people. And if the Olympics need to happen at all, and I'm not necessarily convinced that they have to, especially in light of the fact that they are a totally unsustainable event from the perspective of the environment, then you know what? Maybe these have played their course and it's time to move on. I'd be comfortable with that. But as you mentioned, Adam, there are hugely powerful economic forces. If you look at the corporations that fund the Olympics, if you look at the broadcasters that fund the Olympics, these are some of the biggest names out there. And if you want to break it down, more than 9 out of every $10 that rolls into the International Olympic Committee's coffers, 9 out of $10 comes from either a broadcaster, 61%, or a corporate sponsor, another 30% of their revenues. So that's who they're listening to. Now, Toyota, one of their longtime sponsors, they got shamed into not running their ads during the Tokyo Olympics because it was such an absolute shit show, and the locals didn't want it at all. 83% of the population said they didn't want the Olympics, and Toyota read the signs and they didn't air their ads, and now they're actually pulling out of their sponsorship with the International Olympic Committee. My guess is another car company will probably just swoop in there, but that is really where the power is. And man, it's hard to get those entities to move. So what would I do? I would either just get rid of them entirely if they can't be run in a fair way. You could envision a future, though, where maybe you could do this in a way if a government said, yeah, we're going to pay for it, but then we're also going to take that Olympic Village that we were talking about, and we're going to use it to actually solve whatever problems we have in our society. Almost every major capitalist democracy, big city, has a housing problem right now. Like, what if you just use the Olympic Village to target specific groups that really need help? I mean, I know it sounds a little fanciful, but if you would have asked me that Joe Biden was going to be handing out $1,400 stimulus checks, I would have thought that that was a ridiculous thought too. So, I mean, you just really never know. And you got momentum on your side for change right now. It's just getting some of these big dog entities to change their tune.
Yeah, because I think that there's obviously a culture built around the Olympics. There's, as you know, there's the athletes who look forward to it for 3.5 years. It's, their job is they work in marketing or they're baristas, but their entire like life is competing in these sports. It has its own culture. Obviously, you have sponsorships. And that all seems very wholesome, right? I think no one sort of thinks that that's inherently bad, although there's probably a sort of anarchist critique of nationalism in general being inherently corrosive, regardless of how benign it may seem. I'm sort of two minds about that. But and of course you have people who aren't participating, who are just Olympic people, will get really into it again for the kind of human drama. The fact that it is this high stakes thing, because if you fail, you have to wait 4 years, so everyone's kind of watching for people to fall on their face. And so it's in the people who would look at that and say, look, you guys are just bitter, you're out of shape, you're washed up, you just don't want people to have fun. Everything has a climate footprint, boo fucking who, this is awesome, rah rah, go capitalism. What do you say to those people? I mean, what do you say to people who think that we're just being buzzkills, we're being leftist scolds? And I suppose that's why I asked the question about what it would look like to do it in a way that wasn't just putting a boot on poor people, because I think that this is a common rejoinder we get when we talked to you was it 2 years ago? We did get some people being like, well, everything has a footprint, but especially when we talk about the World Cup. I mean, if you want to build a global socialist project without the World Cup, good luck, buddy. So I think it really is an issue of substantive reform versus just like not having it, because you're right, it's so intimate to people's lives. So I guess it's not really a question, but I'm sort of curious what you think about like how you approach this in a way that is about making it fair rather than just being viewed as, like we are all the time, as just being bitter scolds.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I hear from those folks all the time, rest assured. Olympic superfan 745, like I see you, buddy. But I think the place to really meet those folks that really are Olympic superfans is with the arguments around athletes. Because as you started the show with, the Olympic athletes are what make the games even worth watching in the first place. And they are getting absolutely screwed. Adam, the reason why U.S. athletes are being baristas and other things is because they're not properly funded by the U.S. government. Like a lot of governments around the world spend much more money than the United States with its free market mania that just says you're basically on your own. I mean, there are hundreds of Olympic aspiring athletes who have to start GoFundMe pages. So start with that. Like, we're standing up with some of these people. Meanwhile, this crotchety junta known as the International Olympic Committee, if those guys show up and they're on the executive board, they just show up to the Olympics, they can claim $900 a day in per diem alone. So if you think about the fact that like a U.S. athlete who goes to the Olympics wins a bronze medal, that means you get $15,000. You could be like Henry Kissinger, who, by the way, was an honor member of the International Olympic Committee for a long time before he died. And he could just be sitting there, snoring in the fifth row of the badminton competition, gobbling up these per diems over and over again and making more than an athlete who actually gets a medal at these things. And so, I have mentioned to you guys before that the athletes are just simply not getting their fair share compared to other athletes like the NFL, NBA, NHL, English Premier League of Soccer. All those folks make between 45 and 60% of the revenues from their sport, 45 and 60. Olympic athletes, 4.1%. Okay.
Well, they have a union. That's one reason.
Yeah. That's absolutely the reason.
Is there any effort to try to unionize Olympic athletes? Like, is that something that's come up on your radar? I think it's a lot of people, it sounds extreme, but I think if you told me 5 years ago we would have unionized Starbucks, I would have said it was extreme.
Yeah, no, there's movement. A group that I think is a good to keep an eye on is a group called Global Athlete. They're pretty active on social media, and Global Athlete takes together lots of high-level elite athletes and tries to organize them as a whole, but also sport by sport. You've been seeing organizing inside of track and field. I don't think it's coincidental that just this year, in the last month or so, World Athletics, the international governing body for track and field, announced that gold medal winners will get $50,000 for prize money if you win a gold. If you get silver, I don't think you get anything, actually, which is kind of wild in itself, but $50,000 if you get gold. You also have these entities that are coming from the side that are really challenging the Olympics, such as the Enhanced Games. I don't know if you guys have heard about this crew, but the Enhanced Games folks, they are backed. Oh, you're going to love this, guys.
Those are like Silicon Valley psychos, right?
They are backed by Peter Thiel and run
Yeah.
by
Yeah,
a
I've heard of
very
this.
sharp young man named Aaron D'Souza, who is, my understanding, was kind of one of the thinkers behind the Gawker lawsuit, the Hulk Hogan thing, and with
Okay.
Peter Thiel. Well, now these guys are turning their attention to an alternative to the Olympics that they call the enhanced games. And guess what? They would agree with all of the critiques that we are talking about. In fact, they've used the very same ideas on their webpage. But instead of like us saying, okay, so how can we bring working class folks in and get a fair share? How can we make the Olympics more equitable for everyday people? Their answer is, how can we turn the Olympics into a doping free-for-all where athletes can become totally enhanced using any kind of substance
You
they
know, a
want?
very, very small part of me appreciates the honesty. It's still evil, but a part of me is like, you know what? Just a bunch of guys walking around looking like Jack Reacher.
That's just American gladiators.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and they've had some very high level recently retired athletes that said, hell yeah, and they're doping up and getting ready. My understanding is that they're going to have their first competition next year. My understanding also is that they might have a presence on the ground in Paris where they try to rile up some interest. But look, these
Right.
folks at the enhanced game, setting aside like the health that I'm not convinced about athlete health in that area, but they are saying that the top 10 or so athletes in each one of these sports are going to make upwards of $100,000. That's a whole lot more than
Yeah.
athletes make in the Olympic Games. So, whenever there's alternatives from the outside that threaten the Olympics tend to all of a sudden get interested in,
Oh,
in doing some
yeah,
meaningful reforms.
they look in the couch cushions and find a bunch of coins. But oh,
Exactly. I
sorry,
mean,
I didn't realize I was there. Oh man, I'm sorry.
and it's not just today. I mean, with World Athletics, all of a sudden forking over $50,000, and all the other international federations look at them and like, you guys, like that means we might have to start doing it soon as
Right.
well. If you look in history, I mean, there was the Workers' Olympics in the 1920s and 30s, the Women's Olympics when women were being excluded from the Olympics, and so out of exclusion comes ingenuity and also pressure on the International Olympic Committee. And so
And
that's why I think we're just living in a fascinating moment where there's a confluence of pressures on the IOC right now. And I'm not like a Pollyanna about it. I'm pretty realpolitik, but I think that we're living in a really interesting moment where more and more people are realizing that the Olympics are in a lot of ways kind of a scam. And like, Nima, you were mentioning before from an economic perspective, it's totally a scam. You mentioned that
Yeah.
Oxford study that comes out every 2 years. They find that there's cost overruns with every single Olympics going back to 1960. Every single Olympics, you're going to have cost overruns. And so the word is out. And I think now is a great time to really revisit the model.
Now, you've been talking about where the money comes from, where the money sometimes goes. Oftentimes it goes to like a sleeping Kissinger, right? But something we haven't talked about yet, really, is and surprising maybe for a media criticism show, is the influence that media has over the Olympics in general. And oftentimes, I mean, of course, our own perceptions of the Olympics as watchers, as fans, as consumers of media, quote unquote. And so, in your experience, Jules, in your research, in your writing, can you tell us how you think media fits into all of this? We've talked about these different committees. We've talked about some stuff from the city's perspective, country perspective, athletes perspective. What's the media to do with this?
It's absolutely crucial to the entire enterprise, Nima. And it starts with what you mentioned, that for most of us that aren't going to Paris, and even for some of us that are, it will be a mediated experience. Like we are going to be seeing this through our television sets, through our apps, and so on. And so how the media portray this is really important. NBC, the major broadcaster in the United States, is pretty notorious, to be honest, with like totally avoiding politics. I remember during the Beijing Olympics of 2022, they made a kind of casual mention to repression happening with Uyghur Muslims, and it was like 2 seconds, and like the whole world's hair went on fire as if that was like a big deal. I guess it kind of was, but I mean, really? I mean, sheesh. You can understand a lot about the Olympics by thinking through the media. For starters, as I mentioned to you before, like some 61% of the IOC's revenues come through that. And so they have a lot of power. NBC gives, according to some journalists, in the neighborhood of around 40% of the IOC's revenues. Have you guys ever wondered why the Olympics happen in July and August, the very hottest months of the year? I can tell you in Tokyo, those are horribly humid and hot months. Guess what? It's because NBC doesn't want it encroaching on the football season. which starts in September. And so the very timing of the Olympics comes down to media power in certain ways. Again, athlete health takes a second chair to media power and the needs of NBC. What about future Olympics? I was mentioning before that it looks like the International Olympic Committee may well assign both the 2030 and 2034 Winter Olympics at the same time. Salt Lake City is in the running for either one of those. Like, they think they could take either one of them. But I'm here to tell you that they will very probably not get the 2030 Olympics. And here's why. Because NBC's contract, they paid $7.75 billion a few years back to control the rights to the Olympics in the United States through 2032. So if the IOC can figure out a way of not giving Salt Lake City the Olympics until 2024, it also gives NBC this incentive
34.
to ante up once again with a big fat contract moving forward. You see what I'm saying? Like, almost any decision that gets made about the Olympics has something to do with media money and power.
Yeah, just it's like these. It's the same thing with any kind of sports where it's a natural monopoly, like gas or water, in the sense that, like, you just can't have 5 Olympics. So it's a natural monopoly. This is kind of a global natural monopoly, and they get the brand, they get pivoted in there early, and then there's no competition, and they run it as a cartel. They run it as a racket. They just gouge everybody. They know these athletes will work for peanuts because it's, this is great experience, right? You put it on your Tinder profile. Also, you're just naturally competitive. Again, it's not something totally foreign to me, but I guess that's sort of drilled into certain people, and they know that, and so they just nickel and dime everyone at the bottom. They give the counts and princesses their stipends, and it is just a scam because they have this kind of incumbency, and they're a natural monopoly, and so there's not really any incentive except for competition, which doesn't seem to be forthcoming, except for Peter Thiel's weird libertarian wet dream. There isn't really anything to incentivize them to make. Which is why maybe the one thing that could usher in real reform would be a union, I would think, because because without the athletes, it's just AI Al Michaels, and that's it. What NBC doesn't produce, the IOC doesn't do anything. They just sit on their asses and count money. So I think that would maybe be one way you could make this a little more accountable, a little more democratic. But maybe I'm being a little naive.
No, I think you're totally right. And since there's a lot of momentum right now in terms of unionizing, I think there's more and more athletes that are aware of that reality.
Yeah, I'm really curious about how, you're talking about how we receive this as a mediated experience, obviously, because it's being broadcast, it's being recorded, it's being shown at certain times in certain ways. And edited, right? I mean, for us at times. And so I'm curious as to what we're going to experience, when the world gathers during an ongoing genocide that largely most people in the world do not support, even if governments do, what we're going to see when maybe there are protests or acts of solidarity with Palestine, and how that will be mediated out of our experience here in the United States.
Oh yeah, that'll be
so that is just completely completely marginalized, completely kind of 45-second bleep delay, but you're going to be there in person, Jules, so I'd love to hear from you about what your plans are and maybe how you kind of might experience this different, right? Maybe at times in person, less mediated experience.
Yeah, well, Nima, you're identifying the reason why I even bother to go to the Olympics in the first place. I'll be traveling with my friend and co-writer Dave Zirin, and we're not going to be hanging out in the suites with the International Olympic Committee. We're going to be down in the streets with the protesters, and there will be a huge mobilization alternative opening ceremony. They haven't released the information yet, but stay tuned for that. And there will be organizers that are fighting for the rights of Palestinians. There will be people who are concerned about the environmental effects. There are just straight up anti-Olympics activists, this group called Saccage 2024. They're part of this international anti-Olympics network. And then there's groups like the group you mentioned before, Le Revers de la Médaille, that is the other side of the medal, that is trying to get us to understand displacement. And so there will be protests in the streets, and we will definitely be there to cover it. And I don't anticipate NBC being shoulder to shoulder with us down there at the protest, but that's kind of what we're going to do that's maybe different than the average mainstream
Right.
media. And that's what I think we can contribute, because
Yeah,
there
and
will be
that's-
protests.
And that's that's why it's important to have publications like The Nation and other publications. Y'all, are y'all doing video with Real News or
We
or
are.
you-
Yeah. I'm getting all
Great, yeah.
trained up tomorrow. I'm excited about it. Learn some new skills. So yeah.
over there in Baltimore, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. We're going to
Um,
do some filming and a lot of writing as well.
Awesome. Well, I really look forward to listening to that content. It'll be a good contrast to the sentimental schlock, which I also will be consuming. I'm just going to be honest with you. The scrappy kid from, they always have the B-roll of them like on train tracks,
Right.
Oh,
going
yeah.
back to their
They get
going back to
driven
their
to
hometown
practice
in
for,
Indiana.
16 years by their
Just
single
once
mom.
I went like a sob story about a kid who was like, yeah, he grew up in Santa Monica. His dad was a patent attorney. His mom was a neurosurgeon. That's what I want to see. Give me the real.
There are
situation.
those. They just don't get produced.
No, I know they
Right.
don't. Yeah, or yeah.
Everyone who competes is amazing. That's I love watching it, which is why having these conversations is so important.
Yeah.
And I think that it gets back to that kind of, what do you have to grin and bear, and how do you constantly work toward a more just future for this kind of thing. So Jules, it has been so awesome to talk to you tonight. Have a wonderful time, or at least very professional and non per diemed time with our good friend Dave Zirin over in Paris this summer. Of course, we have been speaking with the great Jules Boykoff, author of 6 books on the Olympic Games, most recently, What Are the Olympics For?, published this year, 2024, by Bristol University Press, and the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Race, Power, and Sportswashing, which was published last year, 2023, by Common Ground. Previously, he was a professional soccer player who represented the U.S. Olympic soccer team in international competition. He currently teaches political science at Pacific University in Oregon and will soon, as I said, be headed over to Paris to cover the games himself with Dave Zirin this summer. Jules, thank you again, as always, for joining us on Citations Needed.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you to the whole Citations Needed team. Thanks very much.
And that will do it for this Citations Needed live stream. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's great to do these. I'm glad we're able to do this, Adam. We will certainly be back with another one as soon as we can. But until then, of course, you all can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded. But that will do it. Thanks again for listening and watching, those of you who tuned in. I'm Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Citations Needed senior producer is Florence Burrow Adams. Producer is Julianne Tweeten. Production assistant is Trendan Lightburn. The newsletter is by Marco Cardolano. Transcriptions by Mahnor Imran. The music is by Granddaddy. Thanks again, everyone. We'll catch you next time.